Keanu Reeves received an invitation to appear on Trevor Noah's popular talk show, and like many of his interviews before, people expected it to be lighthearted and filled with laughter. The producers thought the episode would follow the usual rhythm. Trevor would start with a funny introduction, the audience would cheer loudly, and Keanu would walk out with his calm smile. Everyone in the studio believed it was just another day, another celebrity moment. But for Keanu, this evening meant more. He had been carrying thoughts inside him for a long time, thoughts about life, about struggles, and about lessons he had learned in silence. He did not plan to shock anyone, but he knew that when Trevor asked him about his journey, he would answer with honesty, and that honesty might leave people speechless. The studio was buzzing with excitement even before the show began. Audience members whispered to each other about how much they loved Keanu's movies. Some were dressed in black coats, imitating his Matrix style, while others joked about how many times they had watched John Wick. Keanu's reputation was not just about action roles, people admired him because he seemed so humble despite his fame. He rode the subway like any ordinary person, helped strangers on the street, and never bragged about his success. Trevor himself had mentioned more than once that Keanu was one of his favorite guests. There was something about Keanu's calm energy that made people feel comfortable around him. Backstage, Keanu sat quietly. He greeted the staff with soft smiles and gentle words. Unlike many stars who needed a lot of attention, Keanu preferred to sit in the corner, sipping tea and thinking. A young assistant nervously approached him with some notes, telling him about the schedule for the show. Keanu thanked her kindly, not just with words but with genuine warmth that made her feel seen. She later whispered to another staff member, "He is exactly like people say, kind, simple, and respectful." Keanu listened to the noise of the studio, the laughter and the clapping, and he prepared himself not for an act, but for truth. The cameras turned on, and Trevor walked out with his usual charm. The audience erupted in applause, cheering as the lights flashed across the stage. Trevor made a few opening jokes, speaking about the week's news, throwing in sharp humor that made people laugh and relax. Then he paused, smiled, and announced the guest of the night, "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only, Keanu Reeves." The room filled with loud cheers as Keanu stepped out. He didn't rush, he didn't wave wildly, he simply walked with his gentle smile, his hands slightly raised in greeting, his presence both calm and strong. The audience stood up, giving him a standing ovation even before he sat down. Trevor laughed and said, "See? I don't even get that kind of welcome." Keanu sat across from Trevor, his posture relaxed but his eyes thoughtful. Trevor started with easy questions about Keanu's new film. They laughed about action sequences, joked about stunts, and the audience clapped whenever Keanu shared a funny detail. But Trevor, being a smart host, noticed something. Keanu's answers were light, but his eyes carried a certain depth. It was as if he was waiting for a chance to speak about something more meaningful. Trevor decided to save that moment for later, keeping the conversation flowing smoothly for now. The audience loved every second. They laughed at Trevor's playful comments, cheered when Keanu mentioned his fans, and leaned forward when he described behind-the-scenes stories. The atmosphere was electric, but beneath that, there was a sense that something bigger was waiting to happen. Keanu smiled often, but sometimes he grew quiet between questions, almost as if he was lost in thought. Trevor noticed it and filed it away in his mind, planning to touch on it when the time was right. Backstage, the producers nodded in approval. The ratings would be high, they thought. A global star and a charismatic host, it was a recipe for success. But they had no idea what was about to happen when the conversation turned deeper. They had planned for laughs, but they were not prepared for silence. They were ready for entertainment, but not for wisdom that could pierce through the noise. As the first part of the interview rolled on, Keanu kept surprising everyone with his natural charm. He spoke softly, never rushing, never trying to impress. Trevor teased him about being one of the most mysterious stars in Hollywood, saying, "Keanu, you're probably the only man alive who can ride the subway and still look cooler than everyone else." The audience laughed, and Keanu simply chuckled and said, "I don't think about it that way. I'm just another person trying to get to where I need to go." That one sentence made the audience clap, because it sounded so different from what many other celebrities might say. Keanu's way of speaking made people believe him. His humility was not an act, it was his reality. During the commercial break, Trevor leaned closer to Keanu and said, "You know, people love you because you're real. You don't try too hard." Keanu gave a small smile, looked down for a moment, and then said quietly, "Thank you. I think life teaches us not to try to be someone else." Trevor raised his eyebrows, sensing that behind that short line was a whole story, something worth exploring. He decided he would guide the conversation there in the next segment. When the cameras came back on, Trevor returned to jokes and laughter, keeping the atmosphere light. But everyone could feel a sense of anticipation. Keanu was not just another celebrity guest tonight. Something about the way he sat, the calm in his voice, and the patience in his answers made people feel that a deeper truth was waiting to be shared. The audience didn't know what was coming, Trevor didn't fully know either, but they all sensed that when Keanu finally spoke from his heart, it would not be something anyone could forget. And so, the first part of the show ended, not with shock or drama, but with a quiet promise. The promise of words that would soon surprise Trevor, silence the audience, and later move millions around the world. The cameras came back on after the short break, and Trevor Noah leaned forward with his usual grin. The atmosphere was cheerful. He opened with a playful question about Keanu's legendary movie stunts, asking if he ever got tired of being the guy who never dies on screen. The audience laughed, clapping, and Keanu smiled politely before giving his gentle answer. He admitted that sometimes the stunts were tough, but he loved the process of learning new skills. He even shared a funny story about how he once fell during practice and ended up laughing at himself along with the stunt team. The audience responded with laughter, enjoying his honesty and humility. Trevor, sensing the energy, kept the conversation light. He brought up The Matrix and asked Keanu if he ever got tired of people stopping him on the street to say "You're the one." Keanu chuckled softly and shook his head. He explained that he appreciated the love, because it meant his work had touched people. But then he added something that caught Trevor's attention: "It's not really about me. It's about the story and how people connect to it." The audience clapped again, and Trevor raised his eyebrows, realizing that Keanu was slowly steering the conversation in a deeper direction. The next few minutes were filled with jokes and stories. Trevor teased him about being one of the most unaging actors in Hollywood, and Keanu laughed, saying that he wasn't immune to time. He talked about how he enjoyed simple things: riding his motorcycle, reading, and just being with friends. The crowd found it refreshing to hear a global star talk about ordinary joys. Trevor pointed out that while other celebrities were posting pictures of yachts and luxury homes, Keanu seemed happiest doing the small things. Keanu nodded, smiling, and quietly said, "The small things are usually the big things." That line earned him another round of applause, but Trevor noticed the way Keanu said it. It wasn't just a clever line for TV, it was something he truly believed. As the laughter faded, Trevor leaned in and asked a slightly more personal question. "You've been in Hollywood for decades, and people see you as someone who has stayed grounded. How do you do it?" He expected an answer about discipline, or perhaps about choosing the right friends. But Keanu paused, his expression thoughtful. For a moment, the studio grew quiet. He leaned back in his chair, looked at Trevor, and spoke slowly. "I think it comes from remembering that everything we have is temporary. The fame, the success, the attention, it doesn't last forever. What matters is how you treat people, and what you give back." The audience grew still. Some leaned forward, others exchanged glances, realizing this was not just entertainment anymore. Trevor nodded, surprised by the weight of the answer. He tried to lighten the mood by joking, "So you're telling me, all this time I've been working for applause and it's not permanent?" The audience laughed, and Keanu smiled, but he gently continued, "Applause is beautiful, but it fades the moment the lights go off. What stays is the way people felt because of you. Did you make them feel respected? Did you make them feel seen? That's what lasts." The energy in the room shifted. The audience members who had come expecting jokes now found themselves caught in a moment of reflection. Trevor himself grew more serious, sensing that the conversation had turned towards something far greater than movies. He glanced at the producers, who were offstage, and saw them nodding nervously. They hadn't planned for such a deep conversation, but they also knew this was TV gold. Viewers loved authenticity, and Keanu was giving them that in its purest form. Trevor decided to dig a little deeper. "You've gone through so much in life," he said carefully, "and yet people always describe you as kind, gentle, even humble. How do you stay like that when the world can be so harsh?" Keanu looked at him, and for a moment he didn't answer. The silence in the room grew heavy. Then, in his calm voice, he replied, "Because I know what it feels like to lose. I know what it feels like to hurt. And when you know that, you don't want to add to anyone else's pain." The audience went silent. No laughter, no whispers, just silence. Trevor blinked, clearly moved, and for once, he struggled to find words. He opened his mouth to respond, but then stopped, letting Keanu's words settle. It was a rare moment on television, a global star sitting in front of millions, speaking not about success but about pain, not about fame but about compassion. One woman in the audience was seen wiping her eyes. Another man nodded slowly, as if he was thinking about his own life. Keanu didn't raise his voice, didn't try to be dramatic, he simply told the truth. His words carried weight because they came from lived experience, not from a script. Trevor finally broke the silence with a soft, "Wow." He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a smile that was both amazed and humbled. "Keanu, I thought we were going to talk about stunts and motorcycles, and now you've got the whole audience rethinking life." The audience laughed gently, but it was not the same laughter from before. It was softer, almost respectful. Keanu smiled and shrugged lightly. "Sometimes the questions bring out different answers," he said. From that moment, the interview no longer felt like a regular talk show. The atmosphere had changed. The producers backstage whispered to each other, realizing they had captured something rare and unscripted, heartfelt conversation that would stay with people long after the credits rolled. Trevor adjusted his tone, slowing down, giving Keanu space to share more. He asked about what kept him hopeful, and Keanu spoke about kindness, about small acts that made a difference, about how people often underestimate the power of being gentle in a world that is so loud. Every word seemed to land directly in the hearts of the audience. Instead of clapping for entertainment, they now clapped in appreciation, clapped because they felt something real. Keanu wasn't just answering Trevor's questions, he was answering questions many people had about life, about meaning, about how to move forward despite difficulties. The second part of the show ended with Trevor smiling softly, almost lost in thought himself. He admitted to the audience, "This might be one of the most unexpected conversations I've ever had on this stage." The crowd applauded, and Keanu gave a small bow of gratitude, his calm presence filling the room. The cameras faded to another break, but the silence and the emotions lingered. Everyone watching, both in the studio and those who would later see the broadcast, knew they had just witnessed something special. It wasn't the usual comedy and promotion, it was something much deeper, something that made people reflect. And that was only the beginning. When the cameras came back on after the second break, the atmosphere in the studio felt different from the start of the show. At first, the night had been filled with laughter, cheers, and jokes about action movies, but now the room carried a certain calmness. People leaned forward in their seats, almost holding their breath, waiting to see where the conversation would go. Trevor Noah, usually the master of quick jokes, also seemed gentler, more thoughtful. He knew they had touched something special in the last segment, and he wanted to see if Keanu would open up more. Trevor smiled and asked a question that sounded simple but carried depth. You've been in this business for so long, and you've seen the ups and downs of life. What has been the most important lesson for you personally? It was the kind of question that many celebrities might answer with a cliché, but Keanu took his time. He lowered his eyes for a moment, as if he was searching for the right words, and then he looked back at Trevor with a quiet expression. The most important lesson, Keanu said slowly, is that life is precious and fragile. We think we have so much time, but the truth is, every day is a gift. And the way we use it, the way we treat others during it, that's what matters. The audience grew silent again, listening closely. Trevor nodded and leaned in, encouraging him to go on. Keanu continued, speaking not with the energy of a performer but with the calm tone of someone sharing a personal truth. He spoke about how people often spend their lives chasing things: money, power, fame, but in the end, those things are not what bring peace. At the end of the day, he said softly, you remember the faces, the laughter, the hugs, the kindness someone showed you. That's what stays. Some in the audience were visibly moved. A woman in the front row clasped her hands together, her eyes glistening. Trevor himself seemed caught between his role as a host and his role as a human being who was learning something valuable right in front of him. He gently asked, is that something you've always believed, or something you discovered later? Keanu paused again before answering. I think I discovered it through pain. Sometimes it takes loss to remind us of what's real. When you lose someone, you realize how short everything is. You stop worrying so much about things that don't matter, and you start to see the beauty in the small moments. There was a hush in the studio. The audience had come expecting entertainment, but now they were witnessing something much deeper. Trevor, known for always having a clever response, found himself quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, that's powerful. Keanu smiled faintly, but he didn't try to dramatize anything. His words flowed naturally, without effort, like water moving downstream. He spoke about how in a world filled with noise, people forget to slow down. He explained how he tried to find joy in ordinary things: sharing food with friends, reading a book, helping someone without expecting anything back. He reminded everyone that kindness does not need an audience, and often the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. The audience began nodding, some even clapping quietly in between his sentences. Trevor leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in amazement. You know, I have to tell you, he said, I've had so many conversations on this stage, but the way you're speaking right now, it doesn't feel like an interview. It feels like we're all sitting in a room, just listening to wisdom. The crowd applauded warmly, and Keanu lowered his head slightly, almost shy about the compliment. He was not trying to be wise, he was simply being himself. That humility made his words even more powerful. Trevor then asked, do you ever feel pressure to be someone else, to live up to people's image of you? Keanu shook his head gently. I think the only pressure I feel is to be present. To really listen when someone speaks. To really care. I don't want to live for people's expectations, I want to live for the moments I share with others. His voice carried a softness, but it struck everyone deeply. It was rare to hear a celebrity talk about presence and listening instead of success and achievement. The audience clapped again, this time slower, as if they were showing respect rather than excitement. At that moment, the cameras zoomed in on Trevor. He wasn't smiling like usual. His face showed admiration, almost awe. Keanu, he said, I think you've just changed the way people see interviews. This doesn't even feel like television anymore. The audience laughed softly, but it was true. The energy in the room had completely shifted. What had started as a light, entertaining evening had now become something unforgettable. People were not just watching a celebrity, they were listening to a human being speak from his heart. Trevor, wanting to keep the moment flowing, asked one more thoughtful question: what do you think people should focus on more in life? Keanu leaned back, folded his hands, and answered with a steady voice. Focus on love. Not just romantic love, but love in all forms. Love for your family, your friends, strangers, even for yourself. Because when everything else fades, love is what gives meaning. It's what stays. The room grew emotional again. Several audience members clapped slowly, others wiped their eyes. Trevor placed his hand on his chest and said softly, that's something I'll remember. As the segment came to an end, the music played lightly in the background, but the audience did not cheer the way they usually did. Instead, they clapped in a softer, more thoughtful rhythm. It was not the applause of entertainment, it was the applause of gratitude. Gratitude for hearing something real, something that spoke to their hearts. Backstage, the producers were stunned. They had expected another fun, high-energy episode, but they realized they were witnessing one of the most meaningful interviews in the show's history. They knew this moment would spread far beyond the studio. Trevor closed the segment with a smile, but it wasn't his usual comic smile. It was a gentle one, filled with respect. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I don't know about you, but I feel like I've learned something tonight. The audience clapped again, standing up for Keanu. He nodded humbly, thanking them not with grand gestures but with the same quiet grace that had defined him throughout his life. The cameras faded to another break, but the silence and reflection in the studio remained. People looked at each other, some whispering softly about how unexpected and beautiful the conversation had become. What had started as another evening show had turned into a lesson about life, love, and kindness. And this was only the beginning of what Keanu was about to reveal. The lights dimmed just a little as the cameras returned for the next segment. The audience, who had been whispering softly during the break, quickly settled into silence. There was a certain kind of anticipation now, a sense that they were not just watching a regular talk show but witnessing something unusual. Trevor Noah leaned forward with a thoughtful smile, no longer in his playful mode. He was curious, almost like everyone else in the room, to hear what Keanu Reeves would say next. Trevor began with a slow question, his voice softer than usual. Keanu, you've spoken about love, about kindness, about seeing life as fragile. But I have to ask, how do you keep going? With all the challenges, with all the losses you've faced, how do you keep your spirit alive? The question hung in the air. The audience sat still, waiting. Keanu closed his eyes for a brief second, as if to gather his thoughts, and then looked up. His voice was calm, almost gentle. I keep going because life is still worth living, even with the pain. There's beauty in every corner if we choose to see it. A stranger's smile, a sunrise, a moment of laughter with a friend, these are the things that carry me forward. Trevor's face softened. The audience grew quiet again, their eyes fixed on Keanu. He wasn't speaking in the usual style of a guest promoting a movie, he was speaking as if he was sitting in someone's living room, having an honest conversation. Keanu continued, his tone steady. We all go through hardships. Everyone in this room has faced something. But what I've learned is that we can't let the darkness take everything from us. We have to hold on to the little lights that still shine. The words hit the audience deeply. One man in the second row nodded slowly, as if Keanu had just spoken directly to him. A woman in the back row wiped her eyes quietly. Even Trevor seemed moved, and for once, he didn't rush to add a joke or a clever remark. Instead, he let the moment breathe. Finally, Trevor leaned closer and asked softly, do you ever feel like people misunderstand you? Like they see the action star, the tough guy on screen, but not the human behind it? Keanu gave a small smile. Yes, Sometimes. People expect me to be the character they see in the movies. But the truth is, I'm not a hero. I'm just a person, like everyone else. I feel the same joys, the same pains. Maybe the only difference is that I get to tell stories on screen. But off the screen, I just want to live with some honesty, some kindness. The audience applauded, not loudly this time, but warmly. It was as if they wanted to say thank you for his honesty. Trevor looked around the studio and then back at Keanu. You know, he said, it's rare to have this kind of conversation on television. Usually, people are here to make us laugh, or to talk about their projects. But what you're sharing, it's deeper. And I think people at home are going to feel it too. Keanu shrugged gently, almost embarrassed by the praise. I didn't come here to give speeches, he said softly. I just believe that when you have a chance to speak, maybe it's good to speak from the heart. Because you never know who might need to hear it. That sentence drew a collective sigh from the audience. It was simple, but it was powerful. Trevor placed his hand on his chin, clearly reflecting on the words. You might not know this, but you're giving people hope right now. Sometimes, we don't even realize how badly we need to hear something until we hear it. The crowd clapped again, and this time, some even stood up briefly. Trevor chuckled, see, Keanu. You've turned my comedy show into therapy. The audience laughed lightly, and Keanu chuckled too, breaking the heavy silence with a bit of warmth. But the mood remained thoughtful, even in laughter. Trevor then asked, what do you think the world needs more of right now? Keanu looked around the studio, almost as if he was searching for the right way to put it. Then he said, the world needs more listening. We all talk, we all want to be heard, but very few truly listen. If we could stop and listen to each other, not just to reply, but to understand, I think so many problems would begin to heal. The audience clapped loudly this time. It was an answer that touched everyone because it was both simple and true. Trevor himself looked impressed. Listening, he repeated, that's something we often forget. We're so busy trying to speak louder than everyone else. Keanu nodded. Exactly. We compete to be heard, but we forget to understand. And without understanding, we can't connect. And without connection, life becomes empty. The room grew quiet again, thoughtful. Trevor, always quick with humor, found himself slowing down, respecting the rhythm of the conversation. He admitted openly, I feel like I should be paying you for this wisdom. You're giving us more than a guest is supposed to. Keanu smiled humbly and replied, I don't think of it as wisdom. It's just what life has taught me. I've been lucky to see things in a way that reminds me what matters. At that moment, the cameras caught a wide shot of the audience. Some were smiling softly, some had tears in their eyes, others were just staring at Keanu as if they were afraid to miss a single word. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a television studio to be so quiet, so attentive. Trevor leaned back in his chair and asked a final question for that segment. Keanu, if you could leave one message with the people watching tonight, what would it be? Keanu thought for a moment, then spoke with calm conviction. Be kind. Even when it's hard, even when you don't feel like it, choose kindness. You never know what someone is going through, and your kindness might be the only light they see that day. The words landed like a gentle wave across the audience. A hush filled the room, followed by soft clapping that grew into a standing ovation. Trevor stood up slightly, shaking his head in amazement. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've just had one of the most special moments in this show's history. The cameras faded out for the break, but the energy in the studio lingered. People whispered to each other about how moved they were. Some said they would never forget what they had just heard. Even Trevor, backstage, admitted to his producers, that wasn't an interview. That was a lesson. And while the world outside the studio went on with its usual noise, inside those walls something unforgettable had just happened. Keanu Reeves had spoken not as a star, but as a human being, and his words had left everyone, Trevor, the audience, and soon millions at home, completely speechless. The studio was buzzing with a strange mix of energy during the final break. Some people whispered softly, others sat quietly with thoughtful faces. It wasn't the usual mood of a talk show where laughter carried through the entire night. Something deeper had taken over. The audience wasn't only entertained, they were moved. Trevor Noah, too, seemed quieter backstage. He usually used the breaks to joke with his team, but this time he just sat, shaking his head with a small smile, saying to his producer, "This is different. This is one of those moments people will never forget." When the cameras turned back on for the last segment, Trevor looked at Keanu with warmth and respect. He no longer carried the playful tone of earlier. Instead, his voice was soft, almost like he was speaking to a friend. "Keanu," he began, "tonight you've given us more than stories about movies. You've given us something real. I think everyone here feels it. Before we wrap up, I want to ask, what do you hope people take away from hearing you tonight?" The studio went quiet again. Every eye was on Keanu. He sat still for a moment, thinking carefully, and then spoke in his calm, steady voice. "I hope people remember that life is short, but it can also be beautiful. I hope they choose kindness, not because it's easy, but because it matters. And I hope they never forget that even in dark times, there's always a little light if you look for it." The audience clapped softly, some nodding, some even wiping their eyes. Trevor leaned forward, visibly touched. "You know," he said, "people call you one of the most humble stars in Hollywood. But listening to you, I think it's not just humility, it's perspective. You see life differently." Keanu gave a faint smile. "Maybe. I think it's just that life has a way of teaching us what matters if we're willing to listen." The room felt almost sacred, as though every word was being engraved in memory. Trevor then tried to lighten the mood, joking, "You're going to have everyone calling their family members tonight saying, 'I love you,' and blaming Keanu Reeves for it." The audience laughed gently, grateful for the release of tension, but even in the laughter, the thoughtfulness remained. Keanu chuckled softly and said, "That wouldn't be such a bad thing." The crowd clapped again, louder this time, their cheers mixing with smiles and tears. Trevor shook his head in disbelief. "You've managed to make my comedy show the most meaningful conversation of the week. I don't know how you do it." Keanu's reply was simple. "I didn't do anything special. I just spoke from the heart. And that was exactly what made it special." The cameras zoomed in on Trevor, who looked both amused and deeply moved. He sighed and admitted, "I think this is the first time I've been speechless on my own show." The audience erupted in applause, and Trevor laughed softly, saying, "See, Keanu. You've even taken my words away." As the final minutes of the show ticked away, Trevor asked one last question. "If you had to give one piece of advice to everyone watching at home, something they could carry with them after tonight, what would it be?" Keanu leaned back, thought for a moment, and then looked directly into the camera. His voice was calm but powerful. "Be gentle with yourself and with others. The world can be hard enough. Don't add to that hardness. Instead, try to make it softer, kinder, and more human. Because in the end, that's what we all need." The audience grew still again, listening as though they didn't want to miss a single word. Then came a wave of clapping, rising louder and louder until people stood to their feet. It wasn't the usual excited standing ovation, it was something more respectful, almost like gratitude. Trevor also stood, shaking Keanu's hand firmly, then pulling him into a brief hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "not as a host, but as a person." The cameras captured it all: the standing ovation, the quiet respect, the look on Trevor's face, and Keanu's calm humility. When the closing music began, Trevor addressed the audience one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight wasn't just another show. Tonight, we shared something real. And I think we'll all leave here a little better because of it." The audience clapped once more, cheering softly as the credits rolled. Keanu waved gently to the crowd, his smile quiet, his manner graceful. There were no big gestures, no dramatic exits, just a man leaving the stage as humbly as he had entered it. Backstage, the crew couldn't stop talking about what had happened. One camera operator said, "I've been working here for years, and I've never seen an audience that quiet during a segment. Never." Another producer admitted, "This episode will live forever. People are going to share it again and again." Trevor himself sat down for a moment after the show ended, still a little stunned. "That was magic," he said softly. Within hours of the broadcast, clips of Keanu's words began spreading across social media. People shared the video, adding their own reflections. "This interview changed my perspective. I needed to hear this today. Keanu just reminded me to call my parents." The video went viral, but not because of flashy headlines or controversy. It spread because people connected with the raw honesty, the humanity, and the reminder of what truly matters. News outlets picked it up the next morning. Headlines read, "Keanu Reeves leaves Trevor Noah speechless," and "Keanu's words that stunned a studio audience." Articles described how unusual it was for a late-night show to turn into a heartfelt conversation about life, love, and kindness. Commentators praised Trevor for giving space to such honesty, and praised Keanu for daring to be vulnerable in front of millions. But for Keanu, it wasn't about headlines or views. He returned home quietly, as he always did, not chasing attention. When asked later about the interview, he simply said, "I just wanted to share something real. I didn't expect it to touch so many people. And yet, it had touched millions." People across the world felt a little softer, a little kinder, because of the words spoken on that stage. It wasn't just Trevor who had been left speechless, it was everyone who watched, everyone who listened, everyone who allowed themselves to pause for a moment and reflect. That night, what started as another episode of a talk show had turned into something unforgettable. Keanu Reeves, without raising his voice, without seeking to impress, had reminded the world of the power of kindness, the value of listening, and the beauty of love. And in doing so, he left a mark that no one would forget.